let's begin just with a couple of brief announcements, and then I'll hand the floor over because I can pretty much guarantee you that Dr. Doron is much more fun to listen to than I am. As a reminder, all of you should have a piece of paper where you can write out a question. At the very end of class, Will and Jonathan will be collecting those questions. We'll have some time for Q&A, and so I encourage you to ask those questions if you have them. Also, in his incredible generosity, Dr. Doron has also shared with us one of the CDs that the Holocaust Museum produces, Voices of Anti-Semitism, and 10 priority passes to the U.S. Holocaust Museum. So if there are students who are interested, send me an email or give me your name, and I'll write down your name, and then we'll just do it by lottery. So these are, if you've tried to go to the Holocaust Museum, this is quite a lovely way of getting there. So again, I work for them, I teach for them in the summer, and I don't get these. So if there are some of you who are interested in them, if you think you might be going to the Holocaust Museum over winter break or spring break, I highly recommend letting me know. So thank you, Dr. Doron. That's incredibly generous of you. We are taping this session, and we're doing so for exactly the reason that I've pointed out to you at the very beginning of the semester, which is that you have this unbelievable opportunity to spend some time with somebody who experienced sort of the depth of horror in the 1940s. And like, this population is not a population that we're able to engage with tremendous frequency. And it's really quite lovely of you to be able not just to come here, but also to let us tape this so that other students at Ohio State can have access to it. So I really do appreciate that.
Sure.
So I'm just going to hand over the floor to you and sit over here and take notes and listen to you as I often am wanting to do.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ted Arye Doron, and I was born in November 17, 1938. That's about the time of the Kristallnacht. A few years later, my mother told me that she went to a Jewish doctor when she expected me, and the doctor said, "You are extremely brave to bring a Jewish child in the world today." So that was the start of my experience in life. Anyway, I would like to go back a little bit about I know that the professor already told you about the Jews in Hungary. I would like to say a few more words a little differently. The reason that the majority of the Jews in Budapest survived, it goes back to the end of First World War. Austro-Hungarian Empire lost the war, and they split apart. Hungary regained its independence for the first time in 400 years. Right after the end of the war, when Hungary got independence, a communist revolution took over Hungary. They tried to make a Soviet-style state like Lenin did in Russia. There was an former admiral of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Nicholas Horthy, who organized an army in Austria and took down the communists and took over. He became governor of Hungary. He was very anti-Semitic, but Hungary had a fairly large Jewish population. I would say probably close to 10%, and Budapest, and especially Pest. Budapest is two cities actually. Buda is on the west and Pest on the east side, and the Danube, which is a large river, about the size of Ohio River, dividing it. Anyway, Pest has I would say probably close to 20% of the population was Jewish. A large number of engineers, lawyers, doctors, scientists, university professors were Jewish. And of course that caused some resentment. And when Horthy got into power, he strictly restricted the Jewish entrance to universities. So many of the Jews who still wanted to get a university education packed up and went to Germany. In 1920s, Germany was fairly liberal. Hitler came 10 years later. So many of these Jews ended up in German universities, which were some of the best in the world. They all spoke, of course, fluent German. Austro-Hungarian Empire official language was German. So they grew up in schools, learned, so they all spoke German. There was no problem for them. And they got education in German universities. And beginning of 1930s, when Hitler and the Nazis started taking over Germany, and persecution of Jews started, most of them packed up and ended up lots of them ended up in the United States. I just want to mention a few of them. There's a guy named John von Neumann who ended up in a university in Boston, and he built the first computer. He later was called the father of the computer. Then there was Edward Teller, who was a nuclear scientist, ended up in the Manhattan Project, which built the atom bomb. And he managed the second part of the Manhattan Project when they built the hydrogen bomb. So he was called the father of the hydrogen bomb. And there was another guy called Szilard. He was also a Hungarian Jewish scientist. I have to go back a little bit to explain what his contribution was. In 1930s, they discovered a new particle called neutron. It doesn't exist outside of the nature, but each of you and me, more than half of our weights is made of neutrons in the nuclei of every element. And they managed to make particles in 1930s to get it out of the nuclei and use them to bombard different elements. There was an Italian scientist, Enrico Fermi. He got for his experience with this neutron a Nobel Prize. He was Italian, he wasn't Jewish, he packed up his family, his wife and children were Jewish. That was in the 1930s, so Italy also started getting very anti-Semitic. He went to Stockholm to receive his Nobel Prize. He took with him his family and never went back to Italy. And getting his Nobel Prize there, he went to the US Embassy and applied for immigration. So one of the officials there puts a book in front of him, asked him to read. Here is a Nobel Prize winner, one of the smartest men in the world. He had to prove that he can read. These are rules. He ended up also in the United States and built the first nuclear reactor at University of Chicago. And he was very famous for that. There was another young German woman, Lisa Meitner, her name is, and she also experimented with these new particles, the neutrons. She took the heaviest element in nature, uranium, and bombarded it with these new particles. And she started out with a pure uranium sample, and after the experiment, she discovered that there were medium weight elements there after the bombardment, which had no explanation. She was completely flabbergasted, and after knocking her head against the wall a few times, she came up with an explanation that uranium was undergoing fission. Fission is when a heavy element splits into two medium elements. And she discovered that, and of course, these were all published in scientific journals, so the whole world knew. So that Hungarian Jew, Szilard, knew about it, and she came up with the idea that the reacting particles were a little heavier than the products. So there's some mass disappeared. Now I assume most of you, all of you know Einstein's famous equation, E equal to mc squared. E is energy equal to m, which is mass, and c squared is just a constant, the speed of light in kilometers per second. So Szilard came up with the idea that if there is some mass missing, it's converted to energy. And it could be a very large amount of energy. And he came up with the idea that it could be a basis for a super weapon. And the last thing he wanted is for Hitler to end up with a super weapon. So he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt alerting the American authorities for the possibility of a super weapon. Well, being an immigrant, unknown scientist, his letter would have ended up in a garbage can or someone's filing cabinet. So he drove out to Long Island when Albert Einstein lived, explained his idea to Einstein, who agreed, of course, being the smartest guy around, and he signed the letter. So once you get in Washington a letter from Albert Einstein, that gets attention. That started the Manhattan Project, which ended up building the atom bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki several years later. So these were the contribution to Hungarian Jews who were kicked out from Hungary. So let me get back to then Hungary. Restricted laws were making life a little bit difficult, but still life was fairly normal. And when Hitler attacked Russia and started the Second World War, Hungary was allied with Germany. So when Hitler started pressuring Hungary also for sending the Hungarian Jews to concentration camps at the beginning of the war, Horthy, the Hungarian governor, told him that he needs his Jews because they are the basis of his economy. His engineers, doctors, and lawyers, as I was saying, there are a very large number of them Jews, and he didn't want to do it. Hungarian Jews were very much assimilated. For instance, in Budapest, a large number of Jews lived outside the ghetto. There is a small ghetto. So I started saying there is a ghetto in Budapest, but the majority of the Jews lived outside of the ghetto, all over the city. And it wasn't any problem until the real problem to Hungarian Jews started in March 1944. Horthy, the Hungarian governor, realized the war against the Soviet Union was lost. The Red Army by that time started advancing very close to Hungary, and he wanted out of the war. He contacted the British and the United States, I assume through Switzerland, in the embassy in Switzerland, and tried to negotiate a separate peace for Hungary before the Red Army occupies Hungary. Well, Hitler obviously had a pretty good spy service, and he got wind of it very quickly, and he sent his top commando unit, and they kidnapped Horthy, and I think they shipped him to Portugal. I'm not sure, I don't exactly remember, and put the Hungarian Nazi party's leader into power. That was, I think, around March 1944. Well, that changed the whole situation from day to night for the Hungarian Jews. We started wearing the yellow stars, and certain houses were marked with yellow stars, and Jews were allowed to live only on those houses, where our house wasn't. So we had to move to one of my aunt's house, and then later on that house also got stripped, and we had to move to one of my uncle's house. And that was around November, I remember, because I was born on November 17. I still remember we had a birthday party for my 6th birthday on November 17, 1944. My father was, of course, forced, Jews were forced for forced labor into the front. They didn't carry rifles, but they dug trenches for the Hungarian army and cleared the minefields. He had health problems, so they sent him home. So he was with us when we were in that Yellow Star house. They forced us down to the court in the house. There are large apartment houses in Budapest, and they separated the able-bodied people from the young and old and handicapped. Well, my father, of course, ended up with the able-bodied people, and luckily my mother, who was only 34 years old, tried to look as old as possible, of course, and I guess the Hungarian policeman felt sorry for her, 2 small kids hanging on to her, so he let her go to the older and handicapped. So we stayed there. My father was with a group of people, marched on the streets, and that's the last time we saw him. He ended up in Bergen-Belsen, and after the war, several months after the war, a friend of his showed up in our house and told my mother that my father starved to death there. We ended up in the ghetto and went to several different places. It was very difficult, of course, because we didn't have any place to stay, so we had to beg people to stay in certain places. We ended up in an apartment not very far from the largest synagogue in Europe. I don't know how many people. Had you guys been in Budapest? Anyone? No one. And we ended up not very far from there, and we stayed there until the end of the war. Now, I wanted to mention something. Around the Danube, there are about 30 bronze shoes in memory of Jews who were forced out from the ghetto, lined up at the shore of the Danube, and they shot them in. So their bodies fell into the Danube and floated down with the ice, large chunks of ice toward the Black Sea. I was probably days away from starving to death. Of course, we didn't have any food. And luckily for us, the Soviet army liberated Pest. Buda, the other side of the Danube, was much more difficult. Of course, the Germans blew up all the bridges. So crossing the Danube took quite a bit longer, actually. And we were liberated, and then we went back to our last apartments where we lived. Of course, everything was stolen, windows broken, no heat, no food. Wasn't a pleasant situation, let me put it that way. And that's about it, about my war experience. Anything else you guys want to ask, please? Any questions?
How old were you when you were liberated?
Yeah, 6 years old. I was born in 38 November, and we were liberated in 45 January or so.
After the war, did you continue to live in Budapest, or did you move somewhere else?
I lived until 1956. I lived in Budapest. I went to school there in high school. In 1956, there was a revolution in Hungary against the communist rule, and they wanted the Soviet Red Army out of Hungary and Hungary getting its independence. The revolution was put down, but the Iron Curtain, I don't know if you guys know what the Iron Curtain is. It's divided East and Western Europe with minefields and watching towers, so you couldn't cross. During the revolution, for about 2 months, the border was open. So there were 200,000 Hungarians escaped the Eastern Bloc, went to Austria at the time, and I escaped at that time with one of my friends.
Maybe you could just say a little bit more about that kind of 1956 moment and where you went. Like I know you escaped Austria, and I know what happened, but they don't. So if you could tell them where you went and why you went to where you went, that I think will be instructive for them.
Actually, I escaped twice. The first time my mother agreed that I should go, but then the next morning she decided I shouldn't go. Well, it's an iron curtain, is very dangerous, obviously. She didn't want me to get killed. Well, we met with my friend, and my friend also, so both of us escaped, but I promised my mother I'll come back. So we crossed the border at night, and there was a waiting station, and Austrians welcomed us, gave us hot drinks and some food, put us on a train. And the train took us to Salzburg, to a former US Army base. And we lived there for about, I would say, 4, 5, 6, 7 days. I don't remember exactly. Then, as I told my friend, I promised my mother to go back, so I'm going back. So he came with me. We went to the train. We had no money. We went to the train station, and we got on the Orient Express, which we knew that it's not going to stop between Salzburg and Vienna. So they can throw us out. We went into a restroom, didn't lock the door, figuring the guy will not come in. He did come in, asked for tickets, but we had no money, no ticket. Anyway, we ended up in Vienna. My friend had a relative in Vienna. We stayed there for, I don't know, 4 or 5 days, walking around, enjoying ourselves. That's when I had my first Coca-Cola. I heard so much about Coca-Cola. I was very disappointed, actually. I expected so much more after hearing so much about it. And then we went back, and we wanted to cross back at night to Hungary. Well, there were Soviet troops on the border. They didn't stop Hungarians escaping, but going back, they were afraid American spies are coming back. Because the border is open, so they caught us. We were interrogated for most of the night. After that, they realized that we are just 18 years old to having fun and just wanted to see the world. So they released us the next morning. I went home, and my mother was very disappointed, of course. You were out already, why didn't you stay out? The reason we wanted to go to Israel, my brother, who was 3.5 years older than I was, belonged to a young Jewish organization, and they took them hiking in 1949. That was before the communists completely locked down the East Bloc. So they took a bunch of kids, 30 I think, and paid off the border guards, and they ended up in Vienna, and they promised these young people that your family will follow in a few months. That wasn't that easy. They took them to Israel. He ended up in a kibbutz, and he still lives in Israel with his family, of course. So we wanted to go to Israel. That's why my mother, the second time, encouraged me to leave. She saw that it's not that difficult to escape. So I escaped the second time, and I went to Israel. They wouldn't have let me, Hungarians wouldn't let me out. At 18 years old, I would have had to go to the army, Hungarian army, of course, which I didn't want to do. My mother followed me about 6 months later. And the older people, they gave them passports because they didn't want to pay their pensions, the social security type of pension. So if older people wanted to leave, they didn't mind. They wouldn't let me out, as I said. I ended up in Israel, and I was going to a chemical high school until the last year, 1956. I was in the last year, is a technical high school. They were training us, teaching us to be lab technicians. So within a few months in Israel, I got a job as a lab technician. And while my Hebrew was very, very bad, I knew pretty well chemistry. I was pretty good at it. They gave me a test before they hired me, and then I heard later on that guy who gave me the test, he said he probably knows more chemistry than some of the graduated chemists and engineers, chemical engineers here. I went to the army for 2.5 years. I went back to the job, again to the same job I started after 57, and I still would have liked to study more, but Haifa didn't have, where I lived, didn't have good evening universities, and besides it, I had no money and no money to go to full-time university. So I packed up and went to Montreal. One of my friends, we escaped together, he lived in Montreal. So he sent me an invitation letter, and I received an immigrant visa, ended up in Montreal, and lived there from 1962 to 65. Within a few months, I received a lab technician job again, and then somebody suggested one to try the university. So I went to see the chairman of the science department of a university there in Montreal. This one was for working people. Most of the classes were evening classes. And I explained to him I don't have a piece of paper even that I graduated from kindergarten even. He said, come back next week and I give you a test. So he gave me a test in chemistry, physics, and math, and he gave me credits for 2.5 years of these courses. So within about 1.5 years, I finished. I got married with a Canadian girl, and we packed up, and I applied about 3 graduate schools in the United States at the time, 1965. And I got accepted in the graduate school in University of Rochester in upstate New York. And we went there and we lived there from 65 to 1970. I got my PhD. I called up the immigration service and I said, I have a job offer and I'm getting my PhD, but I have a student visa. What do I do now? So the guy says, start working. Sort of struck me as a what? I say, isn't that illegal? So he yells at me at the phone and said, just do it! So I did it, and later on I got my green card, and of course I'm citizen now. And I retired when I was 77, 3 years earlier, and now I'm retired.
All these different places you've lived in your life, how many languages have you speak, and how many languages can you speak, and how many?
So how many languages?
Yeah.
I speak Hungarian, Hebrew, and English.
And
Not very well, either of them.
and of all those languages, how many did you study in? How high was it difficult to pick up the languages?
Yeah, I'm very bad at with languages. Luckily, with science, I am pretty good, but languages, I'm very bad. Hungarian was easy. That's my mother tongue.
And Hungarian is impossible.
Yeah, it's an extremely difficult language for people to learn who didn't grow up Hungarians, but since it was my mother tongue, it was relatively easy.
What was life like for you and your family right after the war? So right after 1946?
We went back to the apartment when we stayed, as I said. Everything was stolen and there was no food. The first good meal, I remember, one of our neighbors found a dead horse outside on the street. It was middle of the winter, a very cold winter, so it didn't go bad. He cut off a large piece of meat from the horse and he cooked it. and he gave us, I remember that was the first meal, real meal I call I had after the war. We had no money, we had nothing. My mother was a secretary before she got married. After she got married, she didn't work, she stayed home with us. So here she is with 2 small kids, no money, no skill. It wasn't easy. Luckily, my cousin had a small shop where they made pots and pans from aluminum. And what my mother and my cousin, who was about my mother's age, a little bit younger, they took trains to outside Budapest and started bargaining with the farmers. They needed the pots and pans, and we needed food. So she brought home some food, and later on my mother had a shop, and that's the way she made a living. But it was a long time before we, as I said, when we went back to the apartment, everything was stolen. So we had whatever we had on us, that's about it. It wasn't a pleasant. The windows broken, first they put in newspapers, and then they put cardboards, glasses came much, much later. So it was cold, the apartment, most of the time until we found some food to burn and wood to burn in the oven. It wasn't, I don't remember it being very pleasant, let me put it that way.
After, after you were liberated by the Russians, how much anti-Semitism did you see later in your life? Was there any at all?
Oh yeah, Hungarians are very anti-Semitic. I still remember in the 3rd grade, one of my best friends brings a Bible to me, Christian Bible. The Jews killed Jesus Christ. So he's blaming me that I killed Jesus Christ. So I go home, 3rd grade, whatever, 9 years, 10 years. I said, did we kill Jesus Christ? And my mother explained the backing. But that's one of my best friends. So you can imagine, Hungary was, is, and probably will be quite anti-Semitic.
Other questions?
What happened to your extended family? You mentioned a cousin and your aunts and uncles that you stayed with after you escaped.
Out of the 13 cousins, only one was killed. He was 17 years old, and he and his father were taken into a concentration camp, and they never returned. The rest of my cousins, most of them stayed in the ghetto. Some were taken away, but they came back. One of my aunts was taken to Austria, and she was liberated. I don't remember, by the Soviet or the American troops, I don't remember. Anyway, she started coming back, walking back home, and being very weak, lack of food, she didn't make it. She starved to death on the road. But most of my family, as I said, most of the Jews in Budapest survived. Eichmann ended up in Budapest when Hitler took Horthy, the Hungarian governor, and shipped him out. Eichmann, within a few weeks, arrived in Budapest, and being an extremely efficient bureaucrat, in no time he organized the trains to Auschwitz. Most of the Jews killed in Auschwitz were Hungarian Jews, but he started out from the countryside. Hungary had a large Jewish population in the country too, and I would say probably majority, if not most of them, ended up in Auschwitz. Budapest was the last that he had on his schedule, and luckily he didn't have time to do it.
So you were only 6 years old. Did you ever make sense of these events occurring? And if you did, how did you make sense of it?
Did you hear the question?
I don't remember making any sense of it actually. I probably, as you expect from a 6-year-old, you just go where they tell you to go. It happens to you and no choice, and I didn't know any other way to do it. So I don't remember anything special.
How did you get to Columbus?
Well, once I got my PhD, I sent out 300 letters, I think, applying for jobs in the United States. And I received one job offer. There was a recession. It was 1970. The US was in recession. So there's only one job offer I received in Chemical Abstract Service, which is just south of the campus. And I worked there for 47 years.
300 job applications, one job.
How many people lived in the house with you when you were in the ghetto?
It was a huge number of people. As I said, they forced, Budapest had a large Jewish population, as I said before, and they forced most of the Jews who weren't shipped out to concentration camp into a small area of the ghetto. So the apartment we were forced into, there were about 3 or 4 families lived in an apartment, 1-bedroom apartment. All I remember is sleeping beside the wall under the window on the floor. We had no food, and we were, it's a war condition. You just happens to you.
When you were in the ghetto, did you receive any education? Because you were so young, and it was so important to be educated when you were younger, but you didn't really maybe get that opportunity.
The ghetto, we were a very short time actually. I told you in November, in 44 November, we ended up in ghetto, and by January we were liberated by the Soviets. So luckily we were there only for about 2 or 3 months. Otherwise I would have starved to death anyway. So it didn't have no education. I mean, there was no school. So my brother, who was older, he already went to school. I wasn't even in school. But obviously there was no school. That was one of the last things that you would think about it when you starve to death.
Hello, I'm Vincent Messeri. I have to say, you have a perspective on life that nobody here can duplicate, and your perseverance is truly remarkable. And in a room of college kids trying to find their way in life, what advice could you give from experience for kids like us to approach life with no fear and to go after our dreams?
Well, when you don't have a choice, you don't have a choice. I mean, no one asked me, would you like to go to the ghetto or would you like to stay out? Would you like to starve to death or have a good meal? When you're in a situation like that, you just go with the flow. I'm sure all of you would have done the same thing. There's not much else you can do. There's no escaping, especially when I'm 6 years old. But even my father, who was 40 years old, there was no escaping. Anyone who tried to do anything, they shot him down right in the street. I mean, there were dead bodies all over the place. When we were liberated from the ghetto, we were going back to the old apartment, as I said. I still remember seeing dead bodies. I still remember one clearly, a man lying on the street, half on the street, half on the sidewalk, and his rib cage was open and bloody ribs were showing. I mean, I remember that after nearly 80 years. So you live by, I mean, those are the conditions. You don't have a choice. You go.
So can I build upon Vince's question? So one thing that has struck me, and of course I've only known you for a year, but one thing that has struck me about you is sort of the way in which you have moved forward despite this past, right? You have these memories, and I'm wondering if there's a message that you have for the students about sort of how you have sort of created this incredible life for yourself.
Well, somebody was asking me why Jews are hated so much. So I told them, in my opinion, Jews are hardworking, ambitious, and smart. And meaning that you have to be ambitious. I mean, I was ambitious all my life. I got a pretty good education in Hungary. But then when I ended up in Israel, I couldn't go forward. I would have stayed in Israel and worked as a lab technician the rest of my life. So being a little ambitious, I packed up and went to Montreal and got a university education. And then I continued with into United States where I got a PhD.
So with Hungary being an Axis power, did that make people feel like maybe they would be safe from Nazi influence, or did people really kind of feel like it was a matter of time? Like, how are people preparing for that?
I was 6 years old. I don't know the exact what my parents. Somebody asked me last year if I knew about the Auschwitz and the other concentration camps. I'm not aware if my parents knew, but I assume most of my relatives heard about these things. I was 6 years old. You know, when at that age you don't, all you want to do is play or something like that. I don't recall too much of that time.
Other questions? Okay, we're back to the front. Leah.
Did you understand what had happened with your father being 6 years old? Like when he...
Well, all I knew that they took him away. I mean, I remember seeing him marched off with the rest of the group. We were on the streets and he just marched off, and that's the last time I saw him.
And you had heard about, You had heard about his murder at Bergen-Belsen from the friend or cousin who came back. How was that then? Do you remember how that was presented to you from your mother, or do you remember when sort of Bergen-Belsen became sort of a reality for you?
Lots of people didn't return. So all I remember that this man came, and my brother was at school by that time. I was still not in a school. And I remember he came with us, my mother and myself, to one of the government offices, and he swore that my father was dead. So my mother could get a death certificate. Otherwise, there is no... I mean, I assume that was a fairly routine thing at the time, Jews not returning, they were dead. And he swore, and my mother got death certificates, so she could get very little money every month for like Social Security type of deal.
When was it explained to you what was going on in Germany and Poland and Hungary?
I don't recall it. I don't think anything I knew about it. They probably didn't talk much to a 6 years old about this type of things. Not a pleasant subject. So I don't recall.
So looking back on your experience, like, do you feel as though you lost like a lot of your innocence like as a child?
I still recall having a good childhood, actually. My mother was provided for us, and we had a very close family. As I say, a fairly large family in Budapest, cousins, uncles, aunts. And while of course we were very, very poor, I don't recall suffering after the war. During the war it's a different thing. As I say, I nearly starved to death. Later on I was okay.
You described yourself as being very ambitious. When you were 6 and experiencing all of this, you saw a lot of death, unfortunately, and you saw just how quick people's lives could be changed. Do you attribute your ambition to your experiences?
I assume the ambition is with me. I mean, that's the way you, you are born and grow up. My brother, for instance, as I said, he was taken out when he was 14 and ended up in Israel. He never went back to school, but he ended up having a store, and he was hanging curtains, and he's very well off. He didn't get the education, but he's well off and he's living in Israel and has a large family. So there are many different ways to handle it. I like to study. He was very good with his hands. I'm not very good with my hand. I rather use my head than my hands, and vice versa.
Given everything that you've experienced, how are you responding to recent increase in anti-Semitism today?
I'm not surprised. Let me just say that the Jews somehow, as I said, a lot of Jews succeed, and that brings out jealousy, envy, and that brings it by itself. I mean, I ended up fairly well without, as I escaped, we were extremely poor, nearly starved to death, and both my brother and I, and most of my family, succeeded in life. So, and then there are people who don't succeed, and they don't feel too well when the other guy succeeds and I'm not.
What do you recall about your mother through this experience? Like, was she very emotional or just very stern and had to be very strong for everybody involved? And
yeah, she had to be very strong, and she didn't have a choice. Just imagine yourself, you end up with two small kids, no money, no skill. You don't have a choice. You just have to do the best you can do. And obviously she succeeded.
is there any significant moment that really stands out to you that was, I don't know, I don't have the word, that just struck a chord with you, that you took through your life, that reminded you to keep moving forward because of something she...
Well, she had an engagement ring which she kept hidden, so she ended up after the war having the engagement ring with a small diamond, I assume. Anyway, she somehow hid it somewhere in the apartment, and my oldest aunt bargained it away for food. And I remember my mother was shocked.
Can you describe, from 45 to 56, what was the treatment of the Jews like by the communist government?
It wasn't, it wasn't bad. I didn't feel too much anti-Semitism. I went to school with all the Hungarians. There were, I think, out of the 30 in a class, I remember there are 2 or 3 Jews. There was no problem. In 56, after the revolution, they started getting, again, the Hungarians started getting very anti-Semitic.
How religious was your family growing up?
Very little. My brother decided if you live in Israel, you don't have to be religious. You are a Jew anyway in Israel, so you are fine. And I grew up in a communist regime, so there was I went to religious class for 1 or 2 years, first, second, maybe third grade. After that, there was no religion. The communists took out all religion from the schools. So I have very little religion. I remember when I went to Vienna, after I escaped in 56, I went to Hayes, I think is in the news these days. They were giving out to Hungarian Jews, I think $10 worth of Austrian money. So I went there and applied, and the woman put a Bible in front of me and asked me, Hebrew Bible, asked me to read. And I had my bar mitzvah, and I had 1 or 2 years of religious studies, but I couldn't read in Hebrew. And then finally I stumbled on Adonai, which is an abbreviation, and I remember that, so I got some money. Otherwise I would have been kicked out.
You saw so much death and violence from such a young age. You were 6, seeing, bodies in the street. Did you feel like you were desensitized to death? Did that seem, quote unquote, normal to you?
Did you hear the question?
No, I don't think so. It was a long time ago, but then again, in 1956, there was a revolution in Hungary, and there was lots of fighting in Budapest. There were lots of dead bodies. And I remember, for instance, a burned out Soviet Jeep type of vehicle, and 2 Soviet soldiers burned in them, and their bodies shrank to that side. I still have it in my head. There were lots of dead bodies in 45 and 56 I saw. Yeah, it wasn't pleasant. Otherwise I wasn't in war. Despite that I served in the Israeli army, at that point there was no fighting going on.
When you did start school again after you were liberated, what did they teach about the war and the Holocaust? Did they teach you at all?
The communists tried to stay very far away from Holocaust, so there was no subject or anything else learning about it. And even the war is just handled it as a history. That the Hungarians allied with Germany and the Soviet and there was a group of Hungarian communists who were fighting with the Soviets, of course, when they liberated Hungary, they came to power.
I have a question, which is about your relationship with Hungary today. I know a little bit of the answer, but...
I enjoy going back. I go back nearly every year for a week or so. That's my childhood. I like to walk up and down in Budapest, eat some good Hungarian food, which I grew up with, and you can't get around here. And my wife can't cook it. So I enjoy going back.
Was there a particular moment that you decided to share your story with not only all of us, but people who are going to watch this video?
I wrote my autobiography about 10 years ago, something like that, and I sent it to Holocaust Museum. It's there. I don't know anyone who's interested in my story particularly. Even my granddaughter didn't want to come. I wanted to bring my granddaughter here today, and she decided she'd rather would go to the school.
But maybe you can share with the students, when was the first time that you shared your story with students?
Well, last year, I remember I came to the class and was just one of the students, and then at the end of the class everyone was going out. I walked up and I said, well, I'm a Holocaust survivor. She was a little bit taken back, let's put it that way.
When you visit Hungary, is the ghetto that you lived in still standing? And if so, have you visited it or not?
Of course. I still have relatives, cousins, and we keep in touch actually. So, and I do go back. I usually walk. I like to walk, so I walk around the first house where we lived, and then the second house where we lived, and then the ghetto. I walk all over the place. So I do go back. I like to relive my childhood.
Any other questions? Well, then perhaps on that incredibly positive note of sort of making one's peace with one's past, please join me in thanking Dr. Doron.
Right.